A second essay in the volume that follows that tack is Lesley Woods, also a colleague at York University in sociology, very, very well known for her work on police surveillance and more recently on the militarization of policing. And she has a brilliant comparative essay in the volume looking at North America in terms of what she calls in the essay, policing with impunity.
I want to say thanks to Leo and Greg for inviting me. Police impunity. Police impunity is all the rage, it seems, whether we're talking about carding, whether we're talking about the G20, whether we're talking about the Cleveland police shooting 12-year-old Tamir Rice with no indictment. And the police are rarely held to account. So how do we understand that? How do we understand what's going on? My work has mostly been on the policing of protest, but what I used the piece in the Register to do is to try and think about what I'd learned through looking at policing documents, looking at court transcripts, through attending policing conferences and management events, to try and get a sense of what's been going on in terms of the change of the logic and extend it beyond protest policing. One of the reasons I got into this is because I was sick of the caricatures that I participated in on the left of either the police as mindless thugs simply and mechanically enacting the will of the capitalist class, or that they were some sort of omnipotent overlords who understood exactly how to break the coalition that we were building, right? And I felt like these weren't really taking us far enough in order to understand some of the variation and some of the shifts and some of the possibilities of actually fighting back against police power. And I have to say, I really appreciate Reg's paper in particular, because I think we're doing something, trying to do something similar. Okay. I recognize that the police, of course, play a very particular role at enforcing the status quo, right? And also that they're an institution that is in some ways like other institutions. Like other institutions, police agencies and their leaders struggle to defend their legitimacy, to defend their budgets, and to defend their autonomy. And like, a little bit like, not completely like, other public institutions, police agencies in Canada and the US, which is where my research is on, are responding to a context that's being transformed with neoliberal globalization, right? There's a changing state, you all know this. There's austerity budgets, and there's an increasing emphasis towards what Kant talks about, the penal state, right? At the same time, there's changes to the field of policing. There's blurring of lines between police, public police and private police, between the police and the military, and the police and intelligence gathering agencies. And at the same time, there's a spread of a sort of professionalized management style that makes central some of the stuff that Reg was talking about: data collection, measurable results, privatization, outsourcing, sort of a McDonaldization of the practices. This is increasingly happening across international borders, and there's been a real consolidation of a field of professionalized policing where professional organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a host of massive trade shows, trade fairs and conferences, strategic sessions, and companies like Taser and Motorola are central to the spread of best practices of how we should move forward in terms of control and policing that are spreading internationally. Now, these best practices are spreading and they're organized around a language of threat, management, risk, and then you can really see how they're both benefiting those who have power and targeting poor communities, people of color communities, black communities, indigenous communities particularly hard. Now, how these things gain so much weight. Partly it's because the police have a terrible tendency of getting into trouble. When they screw up and they're challenged by movements, by media, by politicians, by other police, they have to work to defend their interests. So this is partly rooted in a book I called Crisis and Control. And I think one of the things that I started to notice in the policing literature is like, they're friggin' struggling as well, right? They have a lot of power. I'm not saying that they don't have a lot of power and a lot of resources, but they're struggling to maintain those things. And over the last 20 years, there have been multiple mini crises and challenges to their legitimacy and challenges to their resources and their practices. And when they have these crises, they turn to who's got the most legitimacy and resources in the field. And this is increasingly these professionalized, privatized corporate actors. Okay. As a result, what we're seeing is policing in Canada, the US, the UK, and other places, though it's not where I've done my research, has changed its logic and strategy to one of preemption, right? And threat assessment. And you can see this in three different practices, three different main best practices that are widely adopted. And the three I'm going to talk about very briefly are intelligence-led policing, community policing, and sometimes what's called strategic incapacitation, sort of militarized protest policing. So the first is intelligence-led policing, which is described by sort of a textbook on the issue as, just get ready for it, a business model and managerial philosophy where data analysis and criminal intelligence are pivotal to an objective decision-making framework that facilitates crime and problem reduction, disruption, and prevention through strategic management and effective enforcement strategies that target prolific and serious offenders. Exactly, right? Exactly, they use all these keywords, right? Instead of traditional reactive policing, intelligence-led policing seeks to be proactive, preventative, scientific, and analytical. Such an approach uses intelligence to prioritize and intervene in order to minimize risk. Well, damn, right? That sounds fantastic. It's like, we're gonna create, I don't know, it doesn't sound fantastic at all, but it's definitely got this emphasis on strategic use of resources that you see in many other fields, right? It was partly, this is something that came to be consolidated as a language in the UK to justify policing budgets and spread internationally to Canada first, and then after 9/11 to the US, where the Department of Justice argued that critical community infrastructures, such as those related to food, agriculture, public health, telecommunications, energy, transportation, and banking, are now seen as potential terrorist targets. As a result, parts of the community that previously did not receive much notice from state and local law enforcement now require keen attention. Right? So this sort of quote starts to show how intelligence-led policing as a philosophy or management strategy has a similar, has a sort of an endless potential of intervention. Right? And this is some of the stuff that we were speaking about. Now, it also sort of bleeds into community policing, which is often portrayed as sort of a softer, less militarized, nicer form of policing. And this is the second best practice I'm going to look at. The US Department of Justice describes community policing as a philosophy that promotes organizational strategies which support the systematic use of partnerships and problem-solving techniques to proactively address the immediate conditions that give rise to public safety issues such as crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. So what on earth does that mean, right? Right, social work, you say. So I mean, proactively address the immediate conditions that give rise to public safety. I can think of lots of ways to do that, right? But policing, this is now seen as the purview of policing, is intervention into social problems and social issues with sort of no end in sight. Now this emphasis, you know, perhaps ironically, emerges partly out of the critiques of the police as being too authoritarian, too out of touch with communities. And so in the 1990s, this idea of community policing, this language anyway, right? The implementation means different things, spread widely, increasing the number of police on the street at the same time that all sorts of other social services are getting cut. Right? So the police are replacing these things. So in this framework, there's an attempt to manage at-risk populations. So in Toronto, we have things like TAVs, anti-gang strategies, hotspot policing. But of course, then we go back to, oh yeah, there's the particular role that the police play in managing the status quo in racialized and classed ways, which means that the more police are doing particular sorts of things, is that velvet glove on an iron fist, right? Okay. The third practice that is the one that I spend the most time on in the book is looking at protest policing. And we see in the 1990s a new model of protest policing emerge. Strategic incapacitation is what I call it. The book was just translated into French and they called it neutralisation, which I actually think is nicer, neutralization of social movements. And it emerges partly in response to some crises of protest policing at APEC and at Seattle, where the existing model of negotiation and permits starts to break down and the police respond. And they respond with the tools that they had started to use in communities of color in the war on drugs and things like that, but they also start to use the tools that are being promoted by the security and defense industries who are looking for new markets, right, in the post-Cold War moment. And that starts to combine this emphasis on intelligence gathering and preemptive arrests, get them before they act, right? And you can see this, I'm sure you all know those examples. An emphasis on less lethal weapons, right? Whether they be pepper spray and tear gas or stun grenades or whatever, there's so many, right? Tasers even. Special militarized units, and an emphasis on spatial control, so barricades and boundaries and pens and catching people. And you see movements, particularly movements that are seen as uncooperative, right? Because not all of the movements face this. If you cooperate and you play the game and you may not face this, but if movements that are seen as threatening because they're uncooperative, if you refuse to play that game, you're going to get policed in that way. And so you see situations like the G20 or Ferguson or the Quebec student movement. So intelligence-led policing, community policing, and strategic incapacitation are three different sets of frameworks and sets of tools, but each approach is being promoted in these professional policing spaces and networks, and each contributes to a pervasiveness of policing and the strengthening of their autonomy, and legitimacy, and resources. Now, all of this comes along with this language of accountability and civil liberties and human rights, but all three correspond with a shrinking space of outside police control, especially in a context post 9/11 of security as the golden gauge of morality, and people are putting up with it, right? And this is where I think the connection is maybe to the volume. Now, the police have always been an authoritarian institution. That's not new. But neoliberal globalization has transformed the field of policing, blurring those lines and shifting the orientation from one of fighting bad guys to one of preempting threat and risk wherever it may be found. The logic of preemption is threaded through all of these three best practices, and each is celebrated by high-status decision makers within these networks. The logics and practices of what some are calling pacification are facilitating increasing police impunity. But it's not uncontested, right? Struggles against it are growing even as the police arm themselves with these things, and there are spaces and variation between forces, right? You can see, even though the emphasis to try and reform police practices is not going to be one that actually solves the problem, given the, capitalism. The push for attempts to try and control, the attempts to try and have some sort of oversight, recognizing that they're going to get corrupted very quickly, the attempts to limit the implementation of a new weapon, a new technique, are important. the attempts to limit the resources, autonomy, and legitimacy of the police will save lives, and it's worth doing. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.